For most of us, when we start our relationship with God, it becomes about us and God. And we're not really caught up in a lot of the stuff that we can end up getting caught up in. Like, which church am I part of? And which doctrines do I believe and not believe? It's not that those things are inherently bad. It's not bad to have good doctrine. It's not bad to be baptized into Christ or to at all, right? To care about what church you're part of. But when those things start becoming or taking precedent over our daily walk, our relationship with God, God strips some of those things away to remind us of what really matters.
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah Desouza, and Dr. David Pocta. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We are in episode 40 today, and we will be talking about Exile. So this is our penultimate episode in this series, God's People Divided. Now, it is the middle of winter here in Boston, so I am getting over a cold, so apologies if I sound a little nasally. But Dave also has an update because his hair is shorter than last week.
Oh, yes, it's true. It's shorter. Yeah, decided to get a haircut. So here we go. Good times.
So, no more wilderness, Dave.
This will be an interesting episode. We're covering Exile. We're calling it Exile because there's a Northern Kingdom exile, there's a Southern Kingdom exile, and we want to talk about exile in general. So this should be interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe we start today with just some simple definitions. Exile can mean many different things. Exile can be a verb. It can be the idea of being expelled from a place, which we're talking about today. Exile can be a noun in the sense of a person who has been expelled. They are called an exile. And exile can be an event. So the community being exiled is called the exile. So this should be fun today, Hannah.
Can't wait.
So why don't we start with the exile in the Northern Kingdom, or for the Northern tribes. You know, we've been now marching through this whole experience in the Northern and the Southern Kingdoms. And so we're going to kind of bring this together to talk about these two different exiles. But maybe you could start here with 2 Kings for us in chapter 17. And just as a reminder, we are now stepping into this place 200 years after this divided kingdom. And we're going to be looking at this 20th king of the North. So if you could read, Hannah, in 2 Kings 17.
Yeah. It says, in the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser, I hope I got that right, of Assyria came up against him. Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messages to King So of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him.
There's a lot going on there.
There is.
We have all kinds of interesting names. So we're now talking about Hoshea, not Hosea, the prophet. This is Hoshea. And we are now talking about who's king in Judah, who's king in Israel, and now we have the king of Assyria. So it can be a little bit confusing. But I liked how you said, what was the name of the king of Assyria again there, Hannah?
Shalmaneser.
Shalmaneser. Wow. This is one of many different interesting names that we'll be exploring today. So we're going to focus here a little bit on Hoshea, this king in the Northern Kingdom. The time here is around 732 BC, and he reigns for about 6 years, and then he ends up becoming a vassal to Assyria. We talked about a vassal. We talked about suzerains and vassals in a previous episode. So before we move on, maybe you could remind us, what is a vassal? How does this work? Can you give us a little reminder?
Yes, briefly, a vassal is a person or a community who is indebted to or has a mutual obligation to a lord or suzerain. And we talked about this in our suzerain and vassal episode. It was episode 13, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of this relationship, and in most secular settings, accepting the status of vassal would mean you're then paying tribute to the suzerain. And you're also swearing unconditional loyalty in covenant. And then that would allow you to remain on the throne in Israel, in this case, as kind of like a puppet king. But of course, this is different from the suzerain and vassal treaty we talked about in our episode, which was between Yahweh and Abraham, or Abram at that time, in which Yahweh kind of flipped the terms on their head in that case, and he took full responsibility for the covenant. And no tribute was asked for, only a return of faithfulness to the relationship. So,
right. No, that's great. Thank you for that reminder. So, Yahweh did turn this upside down, but now in this case, we have more the traditional suzerain vassal relationship. But the king of Assyria, King Shalmaneser, did demand tribute. And we see King Hoshea pays it for a couple years, but then he's not digging the arrangement. So he stops paying the tribute and he reaches out to this Egyptian king named King So for help. The Assyrian king finds out and he has him imprisoned for treachery. And then he comes and besieges Samaria. And this is where the problems really set in for the northern tribes. So why don't you pick this up in 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6 for us?
Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria.
Yeah, Assyria was known for their ability to win when they besieged cities. And the reason is they had this remarkable amount of patience. And so, I mean, think about 3 years. For 3 years, the army surrounds Samaria. And when we've seen this previously in 2 Kings chapter 6, the famine at that time in 2 Kings 6 became so severe that they resorted to cannibalism in Samaria. So we know that the Assyrians were ruthless and they were very patient. So this siege goes on for 3 years. Now, we do understand why this happens because the scriptures tell us why this happens. Can you read 2 Kings 17:7?
Yeah. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt.
Right. So we know that this is a result of the people's behavior. They had worshipped other gods. They'd walked in the customs of other nations surrounding them. They built high places. They set up pillars and sacred poles. They did wicked things, provoking Yahweh to anger.
So it seems as though Assyria becomes God's chosen way of punishing the unfaithfulness of Israel, which some might feel like is harsh, or maybe God being impatient with his people. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, when you read these texts directly, you can really misunderstand. But when you read them in context, there's no way you can say Yahweh's impatient, right? I mean, this is why we see all these prophets being sent. This is why we see all the warnings. And this next passage we're going to look at actually talks about that. But to your point, Hannah, why don't you read this in 2 Kings 17:13? Because it does explain a little bit more about that.
Right. It says, "Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, 'Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets.' They would not listen, but were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in Yahweh their God."
Yeah, so it lays it out specifically in answer to your question. So Yahweh sends the prophets specifically for the purpose of warning his people. Israel and Judah were warned and warned and warned. And they were told the same thing: turn from your evil ways, keep my commandments. But we see another important statement here in this passage. They would not listen because they were stubborn. Human beings are stubborn. And I think this communicates something really important that sometimes people misunderstand. It's not like God's sitting in heaven ready to zap us for our infractions, right? We struggle with something and God's impatient with us. It's the exact opposite. God is really patient, long suffering, as the Bible says. He's filled with grace and mercy. He gives his people time and space to work things out. And yet, in the long haul, if there's no change, if we don't listen, there's consequences. And so just because there's no immediate consequence doesn't mean our bad behavior won't catch up to us. So Yahweh's words here are always this kind of guiding force that we are responsible to come back and listen to. And I think that's what we see. So it's been 200 years, 20 bad kings. So at this point, these tribes in the northern kingdom are finally taken into exile in 722 BC. So if you could just, as we conclude this, there's a couple verses that I think would be helpful to read about this northern kingdom exile in 2 Kings 17, 18, and 22.
Therefore Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. The people of Israel continued in all the sins that Jeroboam committed. They did not depart from them until Yahweh removed Israel out of his sight, as he had foretold through all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their land, from their own land to Assyria until this day.
So there's the bookend. We started, if you remember, with the kings of King Jeroboam. That was the episode we had Dudley with us. And we talked about how Jeroboam's sin would then carry through all these generations. So we have 20 kings now. And at the end of this line, after 200 years, it says, all of Israel continued in the sins of Jeroboam. So Israel was exiled. So that's kind of this exile in the north. But let's shift gears and talk about the exile of Judah is a little more complicated. It actually takes place in 4 different waves over quite a few number of years. But it's also interesting that this exile takes place 120 years later. Do you remember, Hannah, why, I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you remember why this exile happened so much later?
No, I can't remember, Dave.
I didn't. Okay,
I'm not well. My brain is not on top form.
It's true. I shouldn't ask questions like that when you're sick.
I'm
That's
sure
not
I
fair.
would if I thought a little deeper.
You
but I don't.
probably would. Well, remember, there were some good kings that were interspersed in Judah. So these good kings, these reforms, they brought about this kind of patience, I think, where, Yahweh was waiting for them to work things out. So, but now, 120 years later, think about how long that is. I mean, it's 2024 when we're recording this. 120 years ago was before both world wars. It was before the Great Depression. It was a very different time. A lot happens in 120 years. So now Assyria, 120 years ago, Assyria was the superpower that comes to be the punishing agent for Yahweh of Israel. And now we have this other superpower down in Babylon. And this exile is often called the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity. There's a king, Nebuchadnezzar, who comes to conquer Jerusalem and takes a lot of Judah into captivity, but it happens in stages. So it starts in 605 BC. It finishes in 582 BC. So these 4 waves happen over a period of a couple decades. So I want to break this down a little bit and talk about these 4 waves with you. The first one we know about is we read about even in the book of Daniel. And this is the story of Daniel, this initial wave in 605 BC. So there's this battle called the Battle of Carchemish in 605. Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon is at war with the Egyptians, and he wins this war, and he asserts his dominance not only over Egypt, but over Babylon. I'm sorry, not over Babylon, over Judah. So at this time, we have a king called King Jehoiakim. Now, this is, man, the names this week. So Jehoiakim is the king. He's going to have a son named Jehoiakim, not to be confused with Jehoiakim is Jehoiakim. But Jehoiakim is currently the king. And he ends up becoming a vassal to Babylon because Babylon has now become this superpower. And so in this particular exile, Nebuchadnezzar carries off kind of the royals of the community, these elites. And among those was Daniel, and that's where we read about in Daniel chapter 1, which I'll have you read if you don't mind these first 4 verses, because it kind of frames the Daniel story in this first wave of the exile.
In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Yahweh gave Jehoiakim of Judah into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, Dave, it's a tough week, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans.
Right. Good job with all these names. It's tough when you're sick, too, to have to pronounce all these names. So this first deportation, or this first wave of exile, includes the educated elite, the royals, those that belonged to the palace and the king, and many of them were, now this is interesting, right? Many of them were taken into Nebuchadnezzar's court. So they weren't just subjugated, they were brought into and given positions in the court. And that's one of the interesting things we see about the book of Daniel.
Right. Yeah, I think doing some research into like the lives of the exiles, it's very interesting to see what happened to so many of them. And as you said, this first deportation was a lot of the elite, but the majority probably would have been left behind at this point and impoverished, right. And probably a great gender imbalance, as most likely men would have been taken in greater numbers than women. But there was a discovery made in 1893 in the ruins of what would have been the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nippur. And it was around 730 clay tablets that were discovered in these ruins, dating from this time, from the 5th century BC. And they became known as the Murashu tablets, or the Murashu archive, because they detailed all the accounts and business dealings of the Murashu family. That was a prominent banking family. They were landowners, merchants. And so these tablets have all these contracts and receipts and agreements, and there are lots of names on these tablets. And it was a big discovery because what was significant was about 8% of those names were Jewish names. And so it gave everyone and scholars a snapshot of the lives of some of these exiles that were settling in Babylon, that many ended up becoming kind of embedded in this culture. They had the opportunity to work. Some even owned property, which shows kind of these varied experiences of the Jewish exiles. And of course, we know from the Bible that the likes of Daniel and Nehemiah and later on Esther, they were all Jews that managed to rise to prominent positions in the nations where they were exiles, which came with its own tension as they wrestle with their Jewish identity in this foreign nation.
You're right. It is really interesting, and it is a little bit of a unique trait of Babylon's approach to incorporating the Jews into their culture. We don't see that all the time when a conquering nation comes, that they don't do that. But that ends up playing out, which will come all the way back to the return, because there are people in position that can even help later guide the return back. So that's really interesting. Thanks for bringing that up. When we look at this diagram that we've looked at before about the kings, and we'll put it up on the podcast here for you to see, or on the YouTube for you to see. But we've now moving from Jehoiakim, who is now handed off because he's exiled. It's Jehoiakim, his son, who's 18 years old, by the way, who ends up becoming king. And this leads us to the second wave of exile. So this one's a little bit more significant. King Jehoiakim, the 18-year-old, rebels against Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar responds with a besiege or with sieging. I can't even speak today. I'm not the one who's sick, but I'm having a hard time.
You have no excuse.
They respond by besieging Jerusalem. And after the city surrenders, which happens really quickly this time, Jehoiakim and many of the skilled workers and soldiers and craftsmen are taken into exile. If you could read about this for us in 2 Kings 24, verse 10 and on.
Oh, well, I also think the family dinners of Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim, that must have been confusing, right?
Exactly. Good point.
Okay, 2 Kings 24. It says, at that time, the servants of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to the city while his servants were besieging it. King Jehoiakim of Judah gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself, his mother, his servants, his officers, and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. He carried off all the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of Yahweh that King Solomon of Israel had made. All this as Yahweh had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials, all the warriors, 10,000 captives, all the artisans and the smiths. No one remained except the poorest people of the land, which we spoke about, who was left behind.
Right. So this second wave happens about 8 years after the first one. And we are now seeing this society being stripped away, right? So it started with a lot of the elites. Now, of course, the palace and the king now gets repopulated with a new group of people, and they all get peeled away. But in addition to that, we see 10,000 captives. And it's the artisans and the smiths, and it's a lot of the structure, the infrastructure of the society starts getting pulled away. Now, an interesting thing, just kind of as a fun little tangential side note, Jehoiakim, this 18-year-old who surrenders, is put in prison. And we read that he's in prison for 37 years. Nebuchadnezzar ends up dying, and his son takes the throne. And when his son takes the throne, he releases King Jehoiakim and allows him to come and eat at his table, gives him an allowance, and he gets to live out the rest of his days. Now, what's interesting, another interesting piece about that is what Nebuchadnezzar's son's name is. Would you like to give a shot at pronouncing his son's name?
Well, Dave, I feel like you pronounced it so much cooler because you gave it kind of a Lord of the Rings flair.
Oh, when we were talking before, yeah. So all right. So I don't know if this is right. This is just my shot at King Nebuchadnezzar's son's name. Evil Merodach. I think it's more Evil Merodach. Anyway, some of our friends that know Hebrew can probably tell us better how to pronounce those things. So this wave of exile, this second wave, the prophet Ezekiel is taken into exile, and many of the leaders and soldiers and craftsmen. So we'll end up circling back and talking about Ezekiel in a future episode, but that kind of sums up the second. So let's talk about the third wave of exile. This is the one that we most often think about when we think about exile because it includes the fall of Jerusalem. And we're going to do a whole episode on this next time. So this is the most devastating wave because it's the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the temple. And this last king who's reigning is Zedekiah. He reigns for 11 years. And the Bible says in 2 Kings 24, he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, just as Jehoiakim had done. Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah so angered Yahweh that he expels them from his presence. So Zedekiah, in his 9th year of reign, ends up being besieged again by Nebuchadnezzar. This one lasts longer. This is 18 months of the siege. And the famine became so severe that people ran out of food again, as we've seen before. Of course, we talked about cannibalism in Assyria in the northern kingdom, but this time Zedekiah, the king, and his sons decide to make a break for it, right? They're going to try to they're going to break through the wall and try to make a run to get food and escape, but he was captured, and it's pretty brutal. His sons were killed right in front of him. His eyes were gouged out. He was bound in chains. He was taken to Babylon. And as a result of this, most of the remaining population of Judah was exiled. Hannah, could you read 2 Kings 25, verses 8 and beyond for us?
In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of Yahweh, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. All the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had defected to the king of Babylon. All the rest of the multitude. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest people of the land to be vine dressers and tillers of the soil.
Right. I mean, this wave really marks the end of the kingdom of Judah. It's no longer a sovereign state. It really marks the end of the religious and the political institutions.
Yeah. And I imagine how devastating this would have been for the people, as well as kind of the theological challenge this would have presented for the Jews. Even though they worshipped an invisible God, up until now, their understanding of him really was tied to a place. Right. I think of Psalm 137, which is known as a Song of the Exiles, where it says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion," and other places that kind of speak to that perspective. But now Jerusalem is destroyed and they're in a foreign place, and I'm sure they must have wrestled with that sense of being abandoned by their God. And it's given me a new way of looking at a very often quoted verse, and we talk about Jeremiah 29:11 a lot in Christian circles, where it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." It means something different now. We know the context in which that is coming. It's coming to this group of people. It must have been very consoling to have that prophecy come later for this group of Jews in exile.
Yeah, and we're going to explore that quite a bit in this next episode that we do, because the fall of Jerusalem, as you bring up, really leads to having to rethink, what does it mean to worship? They didn't have Jerusalem to go to. They didn't have a temple anymore. And the implications of that, the abandonment that they would feel. So there's a lot to unpack there, which we'll talk about more in our next episode. So this fourth wave that ends up, so remember it says in the verse that you read, some of the poorest people of the land are left just to take care of the crops, the soil, the vines. So basically some farmers are left behind. And in this fourth wave, what happens is Babylon appoints this governor for Judah, just to kind of oversee the land, and his name is Gedaliah, but he's assassinated in 582. And so Babylon, I mean, this is kind of the final straw. They come and bring an end to everything left. If you could read Jeremiah 52, verse 30, it captures this.
In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, I definitely am getting this wrong, but that's okay. The captain of the guard took into exile of the Judeans 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. So in total.
Yeah, so although this is smaller in scale to these other earlier waves, it does mark the end of any organized Jewish presence in the land of Judah during this time.
Right. So this is a lot that we're covering here. Now, maybe this is a big question, but what would you say are the contributing factors then that led to exile? I I know obviously it was disobedience to Yahweh, but some commentators have seen it as kind of a slow fade and maybe compromises that were made over time that resulted in this eventual exile. What do you think, though, about that?
Yeah, the slow fade theory is interesting. I think there's something to be said there, but we see this disobedience. I mean, certainly in the north, we see Jeroboam immediately being disobedient, and the way he behaves gets transferred down generationally. So there is that factor. I think we see, as we saw all the way back with Solomon, the influence of those outside of Israel influencing Israel, which we call the world, right? The world's influence on the people of God. And this led them to all kinds of idolatry. In other words, taking Yahweh, the position that Yahweh is supposed to play in the life of the faithful, and moving Yahweh out to a secondary or tertiary or even further focus. And so you've got high places and false gods and other things that get focused on. I think it does speak to, I think the slow fade comment does speak to the commitment, the discipline, the focus that it does take to stay faithful, to keep Yahweh in that prominent place in our lives. But I think, there's a lot of factors here that play into that.
Yeah, definitely. And we've spoken about these two different exiles in some ways. So we've got the exile that occurred for the northern tribes to Assyria, that kind of was all at once, and then the southern tribes in waves to Babylon. But it's clear that exile is a theme that really begins long before this for God's people, beginning with Eden, when Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden. I think about Abraham is called to be an exile from his land by Yahweh. Moses spends a lot of his life in exile. What do you think is happening here, I guess, with this theme of exile? Because I guess even looking ahead, when we get to the New Testament, Peter will refer to the believers as foreigners and exiles, which suggests, I guess, that the people of God are in some ways always in a form of exile, or are meant to see ourselves as exiles this side of heaven. So can exile be both a season and, I guess, a more permanent state?
Right. No, it's a really good point. Exile as a place, or exile as a space that we're in, is used in contrast to what we perceive as being in the presence of God. So there's this concept, which we talked about when we started talking about presence and mysticism, that God is present. And in many ways, God is always present, but he's also not present.
Right.
The absence of God plays an important role in our spiritual life as well.
Yeah.
So exile represents the non-presence of God, and the Shekinah represented the presence of God. And so this idea of being in the presence and then removed from the presence helps us understand longing. It helps us understand ascending to or coming back into the presence of God. And as you just stated, whether that was Eden or it was Moses, or it becomes us thinking about our eternal dwelling, I think it does play a really important role, and it holds an important tension for us with God's presence and God's non-presence.
There are some parallels, it seems, also between the exile and what the Israelites experienced in the wilderness. And I know we had a whole episode on that idea of it being kind of destabilizing and disoriented time that was also transformative. Are we right to kind of compare those two concepts as well? In what ways might they be similar or different, or how might God be using both of those for his ends?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Exile and wilderness are very parallel concepts, and in some ways they're very interrelated. So when we talk about wilderness, in many ways that connects to exile. So you could say even this process, we talked about Israel in the wilderness, this 40 years of formation, reformation, transformation that's happening there. Exile becomes a similar paradigm. So what the goal of exile is in this case, when we look at the exile to Assyria, or the exile of Babylon, is Yahweh's not saying, I'm done with you forever. He's saying, I'm using this space of my non-presence to transform you, for you to understand and come back to your commitments that we've already established in the past. It's a reformation process. And I think that cycle becomes important for us to understand how Yahweh works or how God works in our life. There's also this powerful cycle happening in Scripture where we move from enslavement to freedom back to enslavement, and God rescuing us from slavery to freedom. And it happens over and over and over and over. So you think about the big narrative that we've covered so far. God's people end up so let's go back to Abraham. He calls Abraham out to help build something new. The people then become enslaved to Egypt. God rescues them from their slavery through Moses, and he brings them into freedom. Then they want to have a king. They find themselves again enslaved to their own monarchy. We actually have slavery under Solomon's reign of his own people, right? Because we find ourselves back, when we don't follow Yahweh's ways, back into slavery. And then they are freed again through what ends up happening here in exile, which they'll come back and remove the monarchy and try to reestablish, going back to their core commitments. So we then, and we'll get to this when we get into the intertestamental period and specifically the New Testament, but then we find ourselves enslaved to the Jewish rules and traditions, the Pharisees' rule, the Sadducees, and Jesus comes to bring freedom again, right? So that cycle is interesting. And we play an incredible role in that. This is not slavery imposed by others. A lot of this is self-imposed slavery, and it comes through idolatry. So whenever something becomes what we put our security in, instead of that covenantal relationship, we end up trusting in the wrong things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think it's interesting because exile and wilderness, and that was my wrestle initially, with them feeling like a punishment, but then also intended, like a necessary part of formation.
Yes.
And so that's, I guess, that tension there.
Well, so let's think about now the big picture with what's happened and is happening in exile. Israel, when they're sitting in that space right before they cross into the promised land, and that we're in the book of Deuteronomy, and we've developed something really important. Israel is dependent on Yahweh. They get their daily manna from Yahweh. They've come to know him as their provider, as their God. They're given this land. They get a fresh start. They're freed from Egypt. All of those things are wonderful and beautiful. But what ends up happening is they start finding their security in three things that become their demise: the land, the temple, and the king. And so when we think about that, all of those three things represented Yahweh's faithfulness in the beginning, and all of them become the obstacles of the problem. So they are in God's promised land, which they become secure in. They've got God's presence in the temple, which they find security in. And they wanted the king to fight their battles, and now they've got security in this king. And what ends up happening in exile is that Yahweh removes those three things. He removes the temple, it gets destroyed, which again, we'll get into. He removes them from the land, so they can't put security in the fact that they have this land, and they don't have a king anymore. And I think this process really becomes about stripping back and restoring the original faithfulness that they came into the promised land with.
Yeah, I think everything you said really resonates, that idea of needing to strip these things away to get back to what they had, or to get back just to them and God as it was initially. How do you think this applies to us and our spirituality? I think there are a lot of lessons we can take here.
Yeah, there are. The same thing happens for us today as Christians, of where we start out and then what we end up putting our security in. For most of us, when we start our relationship with God, it becomes about us and God. It's the priority over everything. Our just being faithful, our changing our worldview, our repentance, walking with God, living in obedience. And we're not really caught up in a lot of the stuff that we can end up getting caught up in. Like, which church am I part of? And which doctrines do I believe and not believe? And caring about, is my church growing? And doctrinal issues and concerns, and so we can tend to put security in things like, well, I was baptized, so even though for the last 20 years I haven't really lived that faithfully to God, I had my baptism. We get secure in these things, and I think that's the same challenge. It's not that those things are inherently bad. It's not bad to have good doctrine. It's not bad to be baptized into Christ or to at all, right? To care about what church you're part of. But when those things start becoming or taking precedent over our daily walk, our relationship with God strips some of those things away to remind us of what really matters. So anyway, that's probably enough for today.
It's rich.
We'll jump into this more in our next episode. So we're going to be talking about the fall of Jerusalem specifically, and we'll get a little bit more into the weeds here about some of these fun things. I hope you feel better by the time we record our next episode.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Jerusalem's fall. So
right.
I'll see you all then.
All right. Thanks, Hannah. We'll see you next episode. Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this bound